Right. All right. So last week we spoke about Golos, the Ari Miklat, and I wanted to spend just a bit of time at the end of Makkos. Right, we're on to Shevuos already, so I wanted to do a few things from Makkos and a couple of things from the new Masechta. Um, so let's just look a little potpourri tonight on Daf Chaf Beis Amud Aleph. The Mishnah at the bottom on 22a says as follows: Kama Malkinoso. So the first thing you have to realize is that we learned the whole Maseches Makkos, and only all the way at the end, with two blot to go, we discuss what Malchus is all about. So that's very typical in general. Sometimes the Masechtas start off on a not the Iker, and it ends up that all the way at the end you finally get to the important parts of the Masechta. I know Masechta Nida is like that. Masechta Gittin has a lot of that element also. So here again, once we're almost done with Makkos, now we finally figure out, okay, um, who is getting Malchus, why, and what is Malchus all about? So the Mishnah says, Arba'im chasar achas, shenemar b'mispar arba'im. So first of all, how many Malchus are there? So the Mishnah says there are 40 minus 1, i.e. 39. Okay, similar to, we have this 40 minus 1 concept also when it comes to the Avos Malachos in the Mishkan. It also says Arba'im Chasar Achas. Okay, and here we bring a pasuk that says B'mispar Arba'im. Okay, Minyan Shehu Samach La'Arba'im. It's not quite 40, right? As we would say in English, not quite. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Arba'im Shleimos Hu Loke. Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and he says no, there are actually 40. And the Gemara and the Mishnah now goes on to explain where exactly is the 40th. It's between his shoulders, and so on and so forth. So we leave it all the way to the end of the Masechta to finally reveal to us what Makkos are all about, how it works, and where they actually hit them. So we saw this concept of 39. So I just found a couple of interesting sources as to why we have 40 Makkos. So the Torah doesn't give a reason why 40 or why 39, but I did find the Gur Aryeh, which is the commentary of the Maharal. The Maharal says, okay, I understand that it's not 40, it's almost 40. So the Maharal says, why didn't you just, say 39 in the Torah? Lama, says the Maharal, I'm reading from the Gur Aryeh, Lama kasav arba'im, v'lo kasav shloshim v'teisha. V'yesh mefarshim, so he goes on to explain, Devadai dinhu sheyilaka arba'im, mipnei shachata. So he says, you absolutely deserve 40, okay, because you sinned, and therefore you should get 40. Keneged arba'im yom shel yetziras havlat. So the Maharal, now 40, as we know in Judaism, is a very important number. We have it a lot. There are some numbers that stand out. We have the number 60, we have the number 49, we have the number 40. There are very important numbers that we see all the time in halacha, and we know that 40, okay, which in two cases is really 39, but 40 is a very important number. And the Maharal connects the 40 Malchus to the 40 days of Yetziras Havlad. Okay, the Gemara in a couple of places mentions that it takes 40 days. Now, we don't know what that means exactly today because it's not that accurate, but the Chacham back then had a concept that it took 40 days for the vlad, for the fetus to form in the womb. Okay, so that's where this number 40 comes from. So what? So says the Maharal, Rak mipnei shehu yizbarach einu me'ir kol chamaso, lakach lo yulaka arba'im shlemos. So because God has a ounce of compassion on us, and he doesn't throw out all of his fury on us, so therefore we don't get 40 full lashes. It's only 39. The hayukorin gamken v'hu rachum. Now, if you remember, Gemara later on says that as they were whipping this person, they would read the psukim, and one of the psukim is v'hu rachum yichaper avon v'lo yashchit. And if you count up all the words in that pasuk, right? This is on Daf Chav Beis Amud Beis. The Maharal says sheyesh bo yud gimel tevos keneged hamalkus. He says it's 13. Right, 39 is really made up of 3 13s. So the pasuk of V'hu Rachum actually has 13 words, which are opposite the 13 that he gets in front, right? And then he gets, one lefanav u'shnei pamim yud gimel la'achrav. Uksiv v'lo ya'ir kol chamato. And what does V'hu Rachum end? V'lo ya'ir kol chamato. God is not going to throw out all of his wrath. So that's the Maharal's connection. Just like we decrease it a little bit, it's no coincidence that the pasuk that is said while we are whipping him is also a pasuk that shows there's a slight bit of compassion, right? Not all of the chema is going to come out. So therefore, he doesn't get 40 full malchus. And then he actually brings up another opinion. He brings on the rush. But anyways, that is one. That's one opinion. And he goes on to continue, and he says he likes that opinion. Ki bevado hayra ililkos arba'im keneged arba'im yom shel yitziras havlad ubiyom ha'achron hu yom arba'im mekabel havlad haneshama. So we're getting into something a little bit esoteric over here. The 40th day is when the baby gets his or her neshama. It takes 39 days to complete, and on day 40, that is the guf. I'm sorry, excuse me. That is the neshama. And he says, Ubaguf hu hachet, shebo hayetzer hara. The haneshama chata imo. So the 40th day, the baby is complete. It has the guf and the neshama. And now it has the capability of being a bar chet. Shekol hamuchuber l'tama harehu kumahu ba'oda im haguf. Anything that's attached to tuma is now considered one piece. Ulefichach amra Torah arba'im yakenu. Sha'af haneshama she'im haguf chayav hamalka. Shekol asher haneshama im haguf shehu chota. It's the neshama together with the guf. Harehi kamohu. Wow. Achein kishamakenu so lamites Makkos ubazeh shav yitziras haguf naki min achet. So what the 39 out of 40 represents is that the guf and the neshama are separating a little bit. You're not getting the 40th. So therefore you have that separation. So Sheken amru chachamim kol chayve malchus niftur midat onshunai de malchus. Because anyone who is liable for malchus, once they get their malchus, they officially have kapara. And after you whipped him 39 times, you have taken out that component of chet from the guf. So what do you have left when you take 39 out of 40? You're left with the neshama by itself. Just like when the baby is created, the last day, the 40th day, is the neshama by itself. Okay, so that's pretty deep for an introduction, but I just thought that, we always talk about 39, and so leave it to the Maharal to tell us something a bit deep on that. The Rabbeinu Bachya, I'm just going to read a little bit. He has a commentary, as we know, on Chumash, and the pasuk says, "V'haya im bin hakos harasha v'hipilu hashofet v'hikahu lefanav kedei rishato bim mispar." Okay, that's the pasuk. Kedei rishato bim mispar. So he says, "Os habeis nekuda b'shva." The bays, the vowel under the letter bays, is a shva. Okay. V'samach lo arba'im klomer b'mispar arba'im v'lo arba'im mamish ela mispar hasamach lo arba'im behen lametes v'im ken k'sha'amar b'mispar arba'im ki'ilu amar lametet v'hatam ha'mispar lazeh shalametes lamalkos lefi shahameis tzarich tichye. The reason why it's 39, he explains that the significance of the number 39 is that the mace, a dead person, needs to be resurrected, so to speak, right? And he needs some kind of chiyus, as they say, he needs some kind of life back. So when you sin, you're in a way chayav misa v'chalal nafsho onosh kares, and therefore you need to be punished by kares. Ki bazeh yichya v'yashuv lo tal shel tichya ka'osam hachayim shahanefesh me'utedet lahem. So therefore, because he is really subject to the penalty of kares, we give him 39 Makkos instead, and that substitutes, in a sense, for his chiyuv misa, and that lametes is equivalent in gematria to tal. Lametes is tal, which is 39, which is due, which God is like tal, is that symbolic item that brings the dead back to life. Okay, that's again very, very Kabbalistic, right? But he gives another reason why the significance of 39 is. So we have one from the Maharal, we have one from Rabbeinu Bachya. Okay, that's pretty heavy stuff for an intro. Let us look at the Sefer HaChinuch, because the Sefer HaChinuch says in number 594. Let me just open it up. 594 is the mitzvah of, found in Kitetze, of mitzvah. It's called mitzvahs lahalkos larasha. Shenitztavu habezdin shabi Yisrael lahalkos haovrim al kitzas mitzvahs haTorah. V'zehu, inyan malkus hanitzkar begamara. V'ka'inyan shekasavti b'chol mitzvah u'mitzvah sheyesh b'chiyuv malkos. Okay, he says it's like what I have written, that each and every mitzvah that has this chiyuv of malchus with it, he says, I'm going to write what I'm going to write. So the question is, what's this all about? So he says, as following in the next paragraph, as we know, the chinuch always goes right into the root of the mitzvah. We are the quintessential children of God. Okay, it says banim atem. We're always compared to banim. So v'ratza baruch hu liasram al haveros. So just like children, either sometimes or frequently, depending on the family, need to be disciplined. That's called liasram al ha'averos. They need to be disciplined for sinning. In order that they should return and end up in olam haba, because that's what this world, as we learned many times, is all about. Okay, inyan shekasuv, and he brings down the chinuch is usually, when we see this a lot, he's very poetic. So he brings down a pasuk in Mishlei. He's comparing the chinuch of us in the eyes of God to your chinuch in a father-son relationship. The pasuk says, "Yaser bincha ki yesh tikva, ve'al hamito al tisa nafshecha, which basically means that you should discipline your child because, while there is still hope. The el hamito al tisa nafshecha. However, do not set your heart on his destruction. So as soon as I read this, I said, "Oh, it's an interesting pasuk, right? Let's look up this pasuk in Mishlei." So this pasuk, interestingly enough, has a couple of different. It has this interpretation that we just that that we just gave. Um, if you look though, there's an Ibn Ezra. Okay, how often do we get to do an Ibn Ezra in Mishlei? He says Perush Acher. He brings down a couple of different explanation. He says Al tisa nafshecha mimenu. Okay, do not set your heart to destroy him. Shetachshoch mimenu musar, by withholding musar from him. Aval haben shehu gadol chema mitzad chamoso hagdola as vehu v'hiyeh mikabel onsho. But a son or a child that is always very, very angry and he's uncontrollable, leave him alone and let him accept his punishment. Meaning sometimes you have to do the opposite, right? The simple interpretation is to be strict, is to discipline your child. But if you can't, sometimes the other solution is just to let him run rampant. And do not try to save him. Because if you, let's use the term, bail him out one time, you will constantly be bailing out your child. Now, I'm not going anywhere near this in terms of direction and advice, and every child obviously is differently, but with the one, and now this is the Ibn Ezra. This isn't this isn't a 21st century psychologist talking. So I found it interesting how we see an example of what we call, I guess we would call this tough love, right? Where you let someone fail, right? Fail, and then over time he or she will learn how to cope with it. So I don't know. Sometimes when you look up these psukim, you find an opposite pshat, and I think it adds a little bit of spice to this. That again, the simple interpretation that the chinuch means is, just discipline him, but don't go too hard, right? And then you have the opposite shot where basically sometimes the best thing to do is leave him or her alone. So I found that quite interesting. And then I saw also there's a pasuk in Akev, in the beginning of Akev. It talks about the shamartas mitzvah, and then it says toward the end of Sheni, if you remember, v'yadata im lavavecha ki kasher yaser ish et beno Hashem elokecha miyasreka. Right? It says you're going to come to the land, and right, but getting there, you should know that just like just like a person disciplines his own child, Hashem elokecha miyasreka. God also has to discipline you. Okay, just like a son disciplines his father. So I'm reading from the Ramban over here. Ki kasher yaser ishes beno sheiten alav letovaso ol musar. By placing him on his son, this burden, this yoke of musar, of instruction. Ki inyan shenamar, just like he quotes the pasuk in Mishlei, yaser bimcha ki yesh tikva ve'el hamito al tisa nafshecha. Okay, so here the Ramban interprets it literally, like most commentators, that that you have to discipline your child and never give up because there's always hope. Okay, but don't go crazy. Okay, don't kill him. So says the Ramban, Ken Hashem Elokecha miyasreka mitchila bi'inoi hamidbar v'nisayon haman. So what's this talking about, this pasuk in Akev? So what's the discipline that we understand the discipline a father shows for his son, but what's going on over here in Akev? This is Vaya'ancha, Vayariveka, right? God is reminding us about the Enoi in the Midbar, about the Man and the Nisyonos and all of our trials and tribulations that we went through before crossing over into the land of Israel. So says the Ramban, just like God is doing this to us, Binu Hamidbar v'Nisayon Haman sheta'arev lenafshecha tovas ha'aretzu peiroseha. Why is God making us miserable? Why is he testing us? Why is he afflicting us in the desert? So that the tova of the land of Israel and its fruits should be sheta'arev lefanecha. The word e'arev means sweet. It should be sweet for us. So this is a very beautiful Ramban telling us that all of this pain, you know the expression no pain, no gain? Here we see that all of what we went through is just so that we should enter into the land, right, and be pleased with its fruits. And if you look at the psukim later on in Ekev, a few psukim later, before the famous pasuk of Eretz Chitu Saora, this is exactly where it is. You're going to go into the land of Eretz Chalav Udvash, and it praises the land of Eretz Yisrael. But it doesn't come without the trials and tribulations. So, getting back, how did we get to here? We got here by quoting this pasuk from the Chinuch about what is Makkos all about. Right, Makkos is all about putting us in line, right, and getting us into shape. Okay, again, Kadesh Yashuvu Elav Yisku Bachronim Baalam Shekulatov Kinyan Shenemar Yaser Bin Chaki Yesh Tikva Bal Hamito Al Tisa Nafshecha Umizeh HaYisod Amru Zichronim LeBracha She'omdim HaMuchoyev Malkus Shelo Yamus B'Maka HaMalkus. And similar to this, what we just said about disciplining your son, but don't go overboard, right, and destroy him. That same concept is exactly what we read in the Mishnah and Daf Chav Beis that says, in order to avoid a tragedy, we have the doctors estimate how many malchus this person could normally take, because we don't want to kill him. We want to make sure that he could withstand what we give him, and we don't want him to die. And that's how they would do it. And even if they started whipping him, once they started, what if they say, okay, this person could take 30, and they saw that they're up to 15 already, and he's about to keel over? They would stop. They don't want to kill him. That's not what this is about. Right? And that's exactly what the chinuch says. So that's a little bit halacha. I wanted to switch gears a little bit on Daf Chav Gimel. On Daf Chav Gimel, there is let me just open it up. There is a famous Gemara. Well, when you talk about famous Gemaras at the end of Makkos, everybody thinks you're referring to the story of Rabbi Akiva. But right before the story of Rabbi Akiva, on Daf Chav Gimel, open it up. Chav Gimel Amud Beis on the bottom is the famous Darash Rabbi Simloi, which is the source for 613 mitzvos. So Rabbi Simloi basically says there are 613 mitzvos. That is the number. How you back into it, that's been for centuries the debate, how we get to 613. But that's the number that you have to get to if you want to write a book on the mitzvos. You got to figure out how to back into 613. We have 611 plus 2. That's what the Gemara says. We have 365 and 248. 365 are the Lota says. The Gemara says on the bottom, Kiminyan Yemos Hachama, Umatayim Va'arbim Mishmona, Asay Keneged Evar Shel Adam. Okay, we know that there aren't exactly 248 bones, but the Chachamim had a different construct of the human body, and we always talk about the Ramach Evarim. Okay, So Amar Rav Hamnuna, Mike Rav Hamnuna says, what's the pasuk? Torah Tivalanu Moshe Morsha. Torah Begamatria, Torah is 611. B'chadsare Anochi Hashem Elokecha. Excuse me, Anochi v'lo yelecha mipi agvur shamanu. Those two were heard at Har Sinai, so they're taken out of the 613. We're not going to talk about that per se. I wanted to hit upon that's the famous Gemara. What's after this is not as well known, because what happens is we start with 613, but the Gemara right away says, okay, however, Ba David v'hemidan al achadesrei. David came and reduced, he went from 613 to 11, and the Gemara quotes the famous Kapitel Tezvav, Tichsev Mizmor LaDavid mi'agur ba'olecha u'mi'yashkun b'har kodshecha. Holach tamim u'po'al tzedek v'dover emes b'lvavo, lo ragal al lashona lo asa l'rehu ra v'cherpa lo nasa al krovo, nivze be'enav nimas v'esirei Hashem yechabed, nishpa lahara v'lo yamir kaspa lo natan b'neshach v'shochad al naki lo lakach ose'ela lo yimot la'olam. This is a very, very beautiful. Unfortunately, we hear it 99% of the times at funerals. That's why whenever you hear this, you're always in a somber mood. At least personally, I always felt that it's a beautiful chapter, but you're always thinking of somebody dying whenever you read this. So it kind of puts a negative spin on it. But what the point of Gemara is trying to make, and the Gemara goes into examples about what all these terms mean, but it says that David has 11 mitzvos, right? About respect and honor and not lending with interest and no bribes and all and without getting into the details, David reduces it to 11. And as you go down further into the Gemara says that if that weren't enough, it says, excuse me, it says, Ba Yeshayahu v'hamid al sheish. Then Yeshayahu went from 11 to 6. Tichsav holas tzedako, sedover meishorim, moas bebetza, mashkos noer kapav, mitmoch shochad, otam ozno mashmiya, damim va'otzem einav maros, bera. Okay, so again, Yeshaya the Navi brings down 6 midos that you need to have. And then, if that weren't enough, the Gemara later on says, Uba Micha v'hemidan al shalosh. Micha the Navi said, all you need is 3 things. So that's 3 things, right? Mishpat, Avas Chesed, and Hatzneleches. And then, for the punchline, is Bachabakuk v'hemidan alachas. Chabakuk says, forget everything. All you need is 1 thing, right? Bachagak v'hemidan alachas. There's only 1 thing that's important. Shenemar v'tzadik be'amunasa yichya, right? The concept of emunah. So there's a famous question, and that's what I want to talk about now and discuss a few solutions to this problem. The problem is that's brought up by many, many commentators is like, what's going on over here? We started with a 613, right? And now what? You're telling me that we don't have 613, we only have 11, we only have 6, we have 3, we have 1, right? So many, many Mefarshim, just for example, the Marsha discusses this. He asked this question. So there's 5 or 6 different approaches, and they all really have the common denominator of it's not literal. Okay, so once you get over that hump, you'll understand that this Gemara is not such a contradiction to the fact that we really have 613 mitzvos, right? So one way of, I'm just going to read it inside, the Sefer HaIkarim, right? That was Rav Yosef Albo, lived in the 1500s. He says, Shekasha al kol ha'adam lahamis al atzmo tayag mitzvos. He says, if you think about it, right, it's so hard. This concept of keeping 613 commandments is virtually impossible. And forget about doing them all together, doing them b'shleimus. It's such an improbable task. Lachen asu hanaviim klalim hakol mitzvos rabos. So his explanation is that look at it like klalim, like subcategories. There's many, many, many single mitzvos, but if you had to categorize it and make like file cabinets, right, you would come up with only a few of them, not 613. So that's exactly, says Rav Yosef Alba, what's going on over here. And when you do these, it's as though you're doing many, many, many dozens of them. Umana David achadas midos tovo sheyesh behen harba mitzvos shal yadam yavola madrega gedola. So basically, what you're doing is when you do one of them, you're in a sense doing 20, 30 of them, because each one represents many, 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 right? It's all categorized. Okay? So, Valderach zeh asa asu Yeshaya, Micha, v'Chabakuk. And as it went on, as the generations went on, that's exactly what Yeshaya did when he reduced it to 6, Micha when he reduced it to 3, the Chabakuk when he reduced it to 1. He says, but certainly, right, that if he thinks if a person did all 11, right, or 6 or 3, depending on which Navi, right, don't think you didn't accomplish everything. He says that's really, in a sense, accomplishing everything just by doing the general, like I said, those general categories. So that's the way one approach to look at it. The Ran, right, the Drashos Haran, he says something a little bit on the same line. He says, Bir, al pima sheshashinu ba'avos, sheyaro ta'adam l'mitzvah kala k'v'chamura. Okay, this is a concept that, gets a lot of press. A lot of people always discuss, well, I like to do different mitzvos because different mitzvos have certain rewards and some don't. So that's why the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos said you shouldn't have favorites, right? Something that's kal should be treated exactly the same as something that's chamor. Why? Because if you think you know what the schar is, says the Mishnah, you're definitely mistaken, because we do not know. She'ein adam yodea matan scharon shel mitzvos. V'hainu sheyesh bein taryag mitzvos kama mitzvos shescharim shakul keneged kama mitzvos acheros. Right? We know, we've heard this many concepts, like Shabbos is like everything, right? It says tzitzis is like, right, there's 6 or 7 mitzvos that if you do, is shakul keneged kol Torah kula, right? If you don't do avodah zarah, it's like you do the whole Torah. If you put on tefillin, it's like you do everything. If you put on tzitzis, there's 3 or 4 other examples that we say are shakul keneged everything. The Amru b'midrash shetam she'atorah lo gilsa eza mitzvah scharim yoser hu kadei shelo yerotzu b'nei adam mitzvahs elu v'yanichu was a mitzvah shescharim muat. Could you imagine if there was a system where it says if you do this, like a video game, if you destroy this, you get this many points. If you do this, you get that many points. So if you do a mitzvah, if you're Mekayim Shabbos and you abstain and you don't work and it's very, very difficult, so you get X amount of points. But if you do something that's very, very trivial, okay, you get less. So what's going to end up happening is that everybody's going to run to those mitzvahs that count more and just forsake those minor mitzvahs that no one cares about, right? So we didn't want that to happen. So the Ran says, Shemoshe Rabbeinu tziva leYisrael taryag mitzvos v'lo gila lahem eza mitzvos charim yoser. That's exactly why we don't have favorites, to tell you which one has more schar. The kavanato hayta l'toeles b'nei doro. So that's for a toeles. That's for people to take advantage of. Shal yidei ken yischazku l'kayim kol mitzvah shebekol mitzvah yeh lahem safek shema mitzvah v'schara meruba mitzvah cheros. So nobody knows what the schar is, so therefore everybody's going to want to do all of them. Right? Sounds logical. V'hayolahem toelis bazeh shekimu es kol hamitzvos fishlimu es nafsham legamri. Amnam kol zahaya b'dor shel Moshe Rabbeinu. So says the Ran, getting back to our Gemara, this whole cheshbon that we're talking about how no one should know what each mitzvah specifically represents, that's all in the earlier generations. As the generations went further and further from Har Sinai, we became on a lesser level, right? As we say, niskatnu hadoros, right? We got worse as time went on. So therefore, V'ra Shema Shalo Gila Moshe Rabbeinu Shescharm Shel Ma'at Min HaMitzvos Yihel Nezek V'lo Toelis. And this fact that when people weren't as observant and the kedusha and everything was less and less and less, so that whole cheshbon that if people are going to do all the mitzvahs, that's not true. We were doing only some of them, right? So and therefore this damaged us, right? She'ilu hayodin scharen shel ma'at min hamitzvos hayim mischaskim l'kayim l'pachos mitzvos elu. V'lachen hemudim David alachas. David said, you know what? It's too much to handle. So I'm going to go from 613 to 11. And I'm going to say, these are the important ones. Because people weren't doing all of them. They were only wanting to do the important ones. So he said, you know what? Okay, we'll make these important. Shahayim makubal letzlo shescharim shel mitzvos elu gadol ma'od. These 11, these are going to be the major ones. V'amar zos la'anshe dor kadei sheyischasku behen v'yisku l'chayil haba. Amlam adayin b'toch achas mitzvos yesh chelik shescharim yoser ma'acherim. Although if you even look at the 11, some are greater than others. But again, just like Moshe didn't say which of the 613 were better, David didn't say which of the 11 were better. He says, you know what? I'm not going to say anything and let them do all 11. That's it. Similar to Moshe. So what happens as you go further in time? From David to Yeshayahu was another few hundred years, so the people got worse. So he says, you know what, we can't even do 11 Nebuch. So they went from 613 to 11, then down to 6. So he says, you know what? I'm going to tell you the basic 6. And as the time went around, as the time went by, the people got less and less and less, so they couldn't handle it. So that's why they have to keep on reducing and reducing and reducing. That is just a logistical explanation from the Ran. Okay, the Maharsha, answers this question, and he says, "Shebarov mitzvos ein matzui sheyiska behen l'chayil olam haba rak miud anashim b'miud zmanim." He says that in most mitzvos, right, most mitzvos do not have that reward of olam haba. It's only done by a few people throughout selected times. Shechelik min ha-mitzvos nohagos rak b'kohanim. Meaning, you're not going to get everything. Out of the 613 mitzvos, 1/3 of them you could already eliminate from an average person doing, not because he doesn't want to do it, but because he can't do it, because he's not a Kohen. So you knock off half of Vayikra, because he can't do the Karbanos. V'chelkam rak b'Leviim v'Yisrael, and some are not Kohen related, they're only by a Levi in Yisrael. V'chelek shayach rak b'nashim, and some are just by women. 20% of them are only when the Beis HaMikdash was around. Then you take another 15% you eliminate because it only applies if you're living in Eretz Yisrael. And that obviously makes sense because we know there's so many mitzvos and you could eliminate between the Kohanim and the this and that. You're already eliminating 60%. Then, all right, you're following his logic. Belavin, ein adam zocha al yadam la'olam haba ela im higia liado perish mimenu. Your reward is not going to come if what? If you don't do all the lavim, not because you aren't good, you never got an opportunity. Just an obscure mitzvah like there's a mitzvah you can't take a mechir kelef, right? You can't take a dog and swap it for an animal, bring it for a korban. Okay, if you don't have a dog or if you're not bringing a korban, then you would never ever entertain this possibility of doing this lav, right? There's a lav of you can't put honey on the mizbeach. That's obviously for a kohen. But even if you're not a kohen, right, you're only makayim that lav if you have honey and you want to bring it on the mizbeach. Then you say, no, I'm not going to do it. So there are very many obscure mitzvos, or I should say lo tases, that thank God we don't do, right? If you never get married, then you'll never ever have the mitzvah of going through a divorce. It sounds funny, but that's the reality of it. Yibum, chalitza, there are some mitzvos that if your brother never dies, then you'll never ever have an opportunity to do yibum or chalitza. So it's not your fault. So that's what the way the Maharsha explains that there are so many mitzvahs that we just can't do. Okay? So people would say, okay, so where's my schar? If I can't do half of these mitzvahs because I'm not a Kohen and I'm not a woman and I don't live in Eretz Yisrael and there's no karbanos. That's what the Maharsha says. So the common denominator with all of these mitzvos that David and Micha and Habakkuk and Yeshayahu, these are what we call universal mitzvos, mitzvos that everybody has an opportunity to do. Very, very beautiful explanation. Okay, we'll stop over there. There's, believe it or not, 2 or 3 other explanations on this Gemara, but you kind of get the sense. So we will conclude Makkos. I wanted to just talk about a few things regarding Masechah Shevuos. So Masechah Shevuos, the first Mishnah. Let's open up the very first Mishnah. Shvuah Shtayin Shehen Arba, Yedias HaTumah Shtayin Shehen Arba. We have 4 themes in this Mishnah about items that the Torah discusses 2 examples, and the Chachamim expanded it to 4 examples. Okay, so regarding the first chapter, where we have already for the last 3-4 days began speaking about this concept of Yedias HaTumah, meaning you became Tameh, you forgot, you either went to the Beis HaMikdash, or you touched something that was Tahor, but you were Tameh. Okay, you touched Kudshim, for example, when you shouldn't have. And then you remembered at the end. So that's called a Yediyah, Halama, and Yediyah. Okay, and what is the penalty? The penalty is you bring a korban. Says the Mishnah, Harezeh be'ole v'yored. There's a very, very unique korban that's bought for this type of forgetting that you were tameh. It's called a korban ole v'yored. So believe it or not, speaking of mitzvos, this korban ole v'yored is mitzvah number 123. I want to look at in the chinuch because the chinuch has some nice ha'aros on this concept. So let me open up 123. 1 second. Sefer Chinuch Parshas Vayikra, number 123. Mitzvah korban ole v'yored. Lahakri of korban ole v'yored al chataim miyuchadim. Okay? So, if you've never learned Kudshim and you never heard of this korban before, this korban of an ole v'yored, and we'll explain what it means, is brought on specific sins. Vehem tumus migdash. The very first one, and that's why Maseches Shevuos talks about it, is the Stein Shehenarba. It's called tumas hamigdash. Klomar, Adam shehu tameh ba'ava tuma. Person touches a sheretz, a dead sheretz, for example. V'nichnas lemigdash bishkaga. V'tumas kadshav gam ken shehu tameh va'achal basar kodesh bishkaga. Or he didn't go into the migdash, but he ate while he was tameh. He ate basar kodesh. Okay, so that's the second example. And then you have what the real Shevuos is about, Ushvuos bitoy. Klomar, shenishba l'sheker al davar lasos o shelo lasos. He made a shvua to do something, and he didn't do it. Usha'artz didei Shevuos bitoy, how you doing? Over aleha bishkaga. He was shogeg. V'chen Shevuos ha'edus, klomar shenishba l'chaver she'eno yodeh lo edus. What is Shevuos ha'edus? It's if I swear to you, after you come to me and say, could you please testify for me? And I swear that I don't know anything about your case. Okay, and then I lie. That's called Shevuos ha'edus. Okay? Al elu chatoim chayav adam lahavi korban ola v'yored. You have to bring a special korban called ola v'yored. Lefi ashro v'anyo shel adam. The reason why it's called ola v'yored, which literally means to go up or to go down, is because it depends whether you have money, whether you could afford it, or whether you cannot afford it. Okay, your wealth is taken into account. Okay, so that is the first paragraph of the Sefer HaChinuch. And the Chinuch actually gives a reason why you have to bring this korban. Okay, and we're going to get to the details in a minute. He says, "Misharshe hamitzvah kamosha amarnu ki inyan hakorban lahazkir ulahashe b'choshev elibo b'koach ha'peula ki hara masav." What's a korban all about? So if you go back to mitzvah number 95, which is the first time the concept of korban is discussed in the Sefer HaChinuch, he says the korban is to remind that what? To have this person who sinned think about the action that made him do the sin. And he should ask for mechila, for God, the zahar al hatid, and that he should be careful about the future. But at the end of the day, God really knows his creations. He knows us. He knows very well what we're capable and what we're not capable of. So, and the fact that he knows, kalos seichel b'nei ish umir havanatam the dalos kocham, right? He says that he's aware about people's intellect, our limitations, right, of the people's understanding, and the weakness of their power. That we may talk a lot, we may try, but at the end of the day, right, we're going to sin. That's just how it is. Again, a very cynical philosophy over here, but I guess it's true. He says we're very weak, right? And he sees kalos seichel b'nei ish umir havanasam v'dalas kochem. We're very weak. Hekel aleim hakapara b'chatayim ha'eleh. So therefore, because we're very vulnerable, let's use that word. So God says, you know what? I'll give you a kapara. I'll be very lenient with you regarding the kind of korban that you will be permitted to get kapara on. Meaning, Hekel aleim hakapara b'chatayim ha'eleh nizkarem lihiyosam kifi osher b'nei adam v'anyam. I'm going to make it go according to what you could afford. Okay? Ulefi shakishlon karov eitzel b'nei adam. Because we stumble, right? The word kishalon means to stumble. Our stumbling is very common amongst us. She'ein safek ki kol chet halashon karov u'tamidi yosem achet ha'maiseh. He says we stumble much more with our tongue than we do with our hands and legs in action, right? So that is an explanation as to why we're bringing this korban when it comes to Shevuos ha'edus. So that's his first example he brings. Why? Because what is Edus all about? Edus is all about uttering. People talk a lot, they promise a lot, they swear a lot, and at the end of the day, they end up sinning a lot because they don't put their money where their mouth is. That's precisely why the Chinuch explains is that God has some kind of mercy because it's very, very, very easy to sin with our mouth more than our actions. And he also explains it regarding Tumas Mikdash v'Kadshav, right? Going into the base of Mikdash when you shouldn't. He says, Gamal Inyan Tumas Mikdash v'Kadshav Yadua Shekishal Matzuba. There's also stumbling when it comes to not taking care of things that are Kodesh. She'inyan HaTahara Kasha Ma'od Al Kol Adam L'Shamru. Ad sheyesh lo lizahar la'adam hatov miskar etzel b'nei adam mechashash tuma. Right? We even reading these Gemaras, this tuma and tahara, it's so difficult to explain and difficult to understand. Right? It's very difficult for people to guard against it, to the point of a person has to be careful who they come into contact with and who they touch. Right? So therefore, because it's so difficult, again, the same concept, God has Rahmanus on us and allows us to bring, if we can't afford it, a korban that is less expensive. Okay, so that's a few paragraphs. Then he says of something very, very interesting. He says, Midine HaMitzvah, Shekol echad me'arba hachatim ha'ela, he says, these people that I mentioned, Machayev osehu lahavi kispa o se'ira kedin chatas kavua hayidua. So let's talk about this mitzvah. Ideally, you should bring a kispa or a se'ira, okay, a lamb. Ve'eno niftar ba'ofa v'kamach elim ken hu ani. But if he can't afford it, he brings birds or he brings flour. What if he's poor and he brings something, a rich man's korban, so he actually does not fulfill his obligation? Okay, this is a very, very controversial line. Many commentators, we're not going to talk about it right now, we don't have time, but this is controversial whether or not someone who can't afford to bring the korban and he brings it anyway, right? You would think the opposite case. But here, right, a rich person, is he yotze if he brings a poor man's korban? But how about the opposite? So the chinuch over here says he's not yotze. Why not? I would think, wow, this guy should win an award because he has this grant, he has a special permit of not having to bring an animal, and he brings it anyway. He should, right? He should win Man of the Year. Says the chinuch, no. Because God has Rachmanus, that's the key word over here. And there's a lot to talk about on that one word, because God has Rachmanus on him, and he says you don't have to go out of your way to buy the more expensive korban. Eno bidin sheyitchak atzmo lahavi biyoter mima shetasig yado. Don't try to be a hero, right? Don't beg, borrow, or steal. Don't do it. And if you do it, you're not going to be Yotze. You are in your special class because you have a permit that you do not need to bring it because you can't afford it. He says, and this concept is for everything. It's not only for this specific korban, it's good advice not to spend more than what you have according to your money. Why? Because it's going to cause you to steal from people, right? When you try to get things that you can't afford. Yan kibo siba ligzol esabrios. You're going to end up stealing. So, and he brings a Gemara in Krisus. okay, to support it. But and he goes on, but this is actually a discussion. We don't have time for it, but there's a Chassam Sofer that discusses this in Masechah Shabbos, whether or not I'm going to have Rahmanas on you. Don't do it. The more expensive carbon. Okay, it's debated. I just want to go over the psukim with you because the pasuk says we're in chapter 5 in Parshas Vayikra. Let me open it up. The psukim say, the pasuk says, Nefesh kitishba levate. Okay, nefesh kisechta v'shama kol ola b'hu edo ra'o yada im lo yagad v'nasa avono o nefesh shartiga b'chol davar tameh. Okay, if you could be a potential aid and you don't say anything, that's the first pasuk. The second pasuk is o nefesh shartiga b'chol davar tameh. Right, if you touch anything that's tameh or benivlas chaya tameh or benivlas behema tameya v'nela mimenu. Oki, and the next pasuk is, or if you touch a tumas adam and your nelam, then the fourth pasuk is, onefesh kitishba levate b'svasayim laharo lahete v'chol sheivata hadam Shevuos nelam imenu v'yadav Hashem lachas me'ela. So now you are officially guilty. You have to bring a carbon. So the pasuk in verse 6 says, here's what you have to do. V'hevias Hashem ola Hashem al chataso shachata nekeva minatzon kispa o seira sizim lachatas. Okay, you bring a kispa, a kesev, okay, as a chatas. Then imlo tagia yado, they say if you can't afford to bring it, then you bring shnei torim o shnei b'nei yonah la Hashem echad lachatas v'echad laolah. You bring birds, but you don't bring one carbon, you bring two carbonos. So that's interesting. If you could afford it, then you bring a kesev. If you can't afford it, you bring birds, but you introduce a new carbon over here. You bring an ola. So the Ibn Ezer, we're back to him again, right? We just discussed him in Mishlei. Now we're going to talk about him in Parshas Vayikra. He says, why are you bringing a chatas and an ola? So let's discuss that. The Omer Rav Yitzchak, he quotes Rav Yitzchak. He says, "Kitam echad ola ba'avur shelo tagia yado ulai ala al rucho machshava." Wow. He says the reason that one of the bird is bought for an ola is because why? Is that a machshava ra'ah, a evil thought may have come into his mind because at the end of the day, he can't afford. So he's feeling bad. He's feeling down. And when you're feeling down, you get machshava ra. So therefore, he says, oh, I can't afford it. Right? So now he has to bring, for having that thought that he can't afford it, a carbon just because he had that thought. Right? And ola is bought if you aren't Mekayim a mitzvah, or if you have a hirhur, right? If you have evil thoughts. So that's when you bring a carbon ola. So because he's upset that he can't afford this carbon, right? It's ironic, he's got to bring another carbon. And I just want to end off on a vote I heard a long time ago. It's funny, it's called a carbon ola v'yored. So what does it mean? Ola means to go up, and yored means to go down. But if you look at the psukim, you're not going up, you're just going down. What's the default? The default is the expensive carbon. If you can't afford gold, you bring the silver. If you can't afford the silver, you bring the bronze. But the Torah doesn't say you should start with the bronze and then go up if you could afford it. And if you could afford more than that, you bring the gold. You're only going down. So what in the world are you going up? Awesome question. For those who have learned Kudshim and always talk about carbon ola v'yored, you're not being ola at all. So the answer is that when you're an ani and you bring this carbon, what's ola is the quality. It's not necessarily the quantity. It's your machshava. If you actually give what you have to give because that's what you could afford, that itself is tantamount to bringing the kispa. So that's a beautiful explanation on why it's called an Ola V'Yored, and it's 9 o'clock, and we didn't get to everything, but I guess we'll stop here. Questions?